is a culmination of a many-year search for definitions of how the rise of the global economy in its current incarnation and how the rise of the information age and all the connectivity associated with it in all its forms alters our definitions of national and international security. Soon after 9/11, and right up to 9/11, I was leading a workshop series atop the World Trade Center with Cantor Fitzgerald, looking at these kinds of issues with a focus on the integration of developing Asia into the global economy. Soon after 9/11, when that project disappeared, I get a call from Art Zabrowski to come work for him as his assistant for strategic futures in the Office of Force Transformation. I said, "What are you looking for?" Because I wasn't interested in moving back to Washington, although I was willing to fly down on a regular basis. He said, "What I'm looking for really is a brief that elevates the discussion of transformation above the whack list," meaning what gets cut. And he said, "I really want a national grand strategy to be enunciated in this brief, one that will encompass what I believe and what I think you recognize," he says, will be an emerging set of new rules coming out of the 9/11 experience for the U.S. military. So in effect, he was asking me to come up with a comprehensive overarching national grand strategy and a view of the world that would make sense to people trying to figure out the Bush administration, which doesn't have a great record of explaining itself in these kinds of things. And the brief worked fairly well in that regard, and it's something now that I give to basically all the one-stars in the various military services as they achieve flag rank. And I come in and I brief new appointees on a regular basis, because for Rumsfeld and Company, they like to say it's the quickest 2 hours immersion in a kind of worldview that fits and explains theirs. I'm going to give you a quick 1-hour version here. It does really give you most of the ideas that are encompassed in the Pentagon's new map book. That's 160,000 words. Typically I go about 8,000 words when I give a brief like this, so you can get a sense of the scrunch down. And the new book really comes out in October. I like to describe the first book as system diagnostic, and the second book really more as nation-state prescriptive. And then I imagine a third book in the trilogy that'll bring it down even more to the level of individuals and speak to the way that individuals can think strategically about their own future and about national futures and about global futures, sort of a how-to guide in terms of thinking in this way. I'm going to give you an argument without going through the globalization historical periods about why we're in a difficult situation now in terms of our response to what I like to describe as the rising demand curve for the U.S. exporting of security. Now, when I say exporting security, I'm not talking about arms transfers. I'm talking about the time and attention spent by our forces with regard to any region's potential or actual levels of mass violence. I say that because our people are our most precious things, not because I love them that much more than anything else, but because they really are expensive. They're expensive politically, economically, spiritually. We've been exporting security around the planet for about 70 years now. For the biggest chunk of that time period, we had a competitor in the process. If we exported too much to a particular country or region, he got pissed off. If he did it, we got pissed off. That was the nature of the bipolar situation. That competitor goes away for all practical purposes starting in the early 1980s when the Soviets start pulling out of countries of socialist orientation, and their great retreat begins. But they really disappear at the end of the 1980s, and at that point, demand for our services skyrocket. Here's the best measure I've come up with to capture this. Not named operations, which the Air Force quickly cracked as a code, because then they started declaring a named operation for every C-130 that went anywhere. And as soon as the Navy said, we did 150 crisis responses, the Air Force would say, well, we did 5,000. Better way to describe this, I would argue, is to look at combined service crisis response days. It's a crude measure, but it's a better measure. So if I send Navy, Marines, Air Force, and Army, you can't get the data or you can't show it. from SOCOM. If I send all 4 of those services to Somalia, say, for 100 days, I would call that 4 times 100 equals 400 billable service crisis response days. Here's some numbers, some decades. The 70s, about 10,000 days, not including a Vietnam, ongoing conflict. So I'm talking about crisis response, something that happens that we respond to. In the 80s, a rough doubling, thanks to sort of last gasp heyday of interstate war, largely focused around the Middle East. But frankly, we don't see interstate war anymore. What we see are coalitions of nations coming together to enforce rules against bad actors in the system. Sometimes individuals, sometimes just regimes. But we really don't see interstate war. The last good interstate war, Ethiopia and Eritrea in the late 1990s. Soviets go away at the end of the 80s. Demand for our services roughly quadruples. Now, how do we deal with this rising demand curve, coupling it with a flat resource base? And if I project ahead, our best numbers to describe this decade says, if we use the old measures, we're looking at roughly 150, 180,000 days. Now, how we dealt with this rising demand curve, I'll say, was in 4 ways. First, we pretended it wasn't there. That's basically the Powell Doctrine. As soon as I can't find anybody else to air out in a situation, I leave as quickly as possible. If that buys me a return date 5 to 7 years later, so be it. We don't do windows. We tried to technologize the problem away across the 1990s. The problem was we spent all our money, frankly, on the lethal or kinetic side of the house. Almost nothing on non-lethal, even though Tony Zinni told us, coming out of Somalia, arm your Humvees, buy lots of body armor, be prepared for these sorts of situations. The Army basically refused to listen to that advice. And then last December, when the hillbilly armor question came to Rumsfeld, the Army sort of pretended that it was his fault that afternoon, when in reality the better answer he could have given to that question was not that you go to war with the Army that you have instead of the Army that you want. You really go to war with the Army that you've been wanting for the last 10 to 15 years. And the Army that the Army had been wanting for the last 10 to 15 years did not do nation building, did not engage in that sort of activity. So it didn't need armored Humvees. Well, it corrects that imbalance as fast as possible. We outsourced like crazy, quickly tapped our NATO allies, began the huge buildup that was surprising to some, not to others, in the private sector entities like the Kellogg Brown and Roots, who come quite naturally out of the oil field services industry. And fourth, we ran our reserves ragged. Number 1 gets you bad planning for the post-war occupation. Number 2 gets you bad resourcing. Number 3 gets you bad command and control. Number 4 gets you the wrong people with the wrong skills in the wrong place at the wrong time. You can basically explain every snafu we've experienced in Iraq, besides the ultimate snafu of not really planning well or engaging in it nearly enough, in our response to this rising demand curve across the 1990s. Our market was changing, and we were refusing to recognize that. Now I'm going to draw a line here and say everything below it, cats and dogs, meaning an Ivory Coast here, typhoon there. I guarantee you're going to do roughly 10,000 days, the autonomic response. Above that line are choices, though. We decided to go into the Middle East across the 1990s in a big, big way, started to concentrate our activities there. Iran, Iraq, tanker wars, Israel and Lebanon, terrorism in the Med. We decided to keep Saddam in the box, bombing him for 12 years, killing roughly 50,000 individuals on an annual basis through our sanctions, except most of them, almost all of them, were under the age of 5 or over 65. So that 500,000 or so that we killed didn't really matter because they didn't have American bullets going through them. And then we kept Monty Python's Black Knight, Milosevic, in his box, lopping off limbs of his body politic as he idiotically fought on. He taunts us still from The Hague. And then we engaged in so-called massive nation-building efforts across the 1990s, which don't look so massive in retrospect. I used to say prior to getting that estimate about the 2000s that my guess for the 1990s was that the world, if it had its way, would have had about a 250,000-day response from us. And 9/11 triggers that kind of high-end op-tempo. The question you need to ask about the 1990s is, what did we get for all that effort? How did we try to shape the world? And my argument is, if you want to try to shape the world, you have to have a clear understanding of what it looks like. And that's been a tough sell for us. Here's the original article from the March 2003 Esquire magazine. I'll take you back to the beginning of the Cold War era, make a stretching argument. Where we had our stuff and where we did our business in the 50s and 60s was largely in sync. We had our stuff, we did our business. In Europe, think Berlin crises, we had our stuff and we did our business. Northeast Asia, think MacArthur in Japan, think Korea, think about a bridge too far in Vietnam. There's your basic containment strategy. Box the Soviets in left and right. Do not worry about the fallout. Well, 4 key events start to pull us towards that center of the world, where our activity has been, frankly, quite concentrated since that time. Those 4 key events: the European detente settled the question, a superpower rivalry between us and the Soviets in Europe, sent that competition south with the fall of the Portuguese Empire. Sub-Saharan Africa, 1975, the countries of socialist orientation emerge. That's what the Soviets get. We counter much more cheaply with the Reagan doctrine. We give the rebels arms. The 73 war alerts us to the functioning of the global economy. Oil is a potential disruptive element within it. I could show you the crisis response pattern from EUCOM. It shifts from one side of the Med to the other across the 1970s. Same thing happens on the other side of the world. Vietnam ends, fall of the Shah of Iran. Issue we still deal with. PACOM's crisis response pattern shifts from one side of Asia to the other across the 1970s. By the time we create CENTCOM in the early 1980s, now the most famous of regional commands, you're looking at 55% for the decade, cumulative combined crisis response days for the 4 services, inside the red circle, 55%. But with the early money, Navy and Marines, 75%, which told us it was going to get a more concentrated situation for us. Jump ahead to 2000, Bush administration comes in. Their complaint with the Clinton administration largely dovetails with my shorthand for the 1990s, which is economics got ahead of politics, technology, connectivity got ahead of security. And gaps began to emerge between the rule sets that defined economics and connectivity and technology and the rule sets that defined politics and military. So no surprise when a 9/11 reveals those rule set gaps, we get a flood of new rules that have to do fundamentally with security. 2 biggest packages. Internally, Patriot Act, to a certain extent, the Sarbanes-Oxley as a fellow traveler. Externally, the biggest one, obviously, preemption strategy. Now, my problem with the Bush administration was their fixation on China, which frankly still exists in many quarters. And we're seeing the resurgence of that in the fight over the QDR. So the Bush people came in, said, we're going to focus on the big pieces of the security order, accusing the Clinton administration of focusing myopically on the big pieces of the international financial and trade architecture. And so they were going to correct. But coming in right up to September 11th, frankly, the focus was on, you have to go back and look at this if you don't believe me, India, Russia, China. No interest in the Middle East, bragged about having no interest in nation building, Mutwa, any of that crap. Well, their fixation on China lessens dramatically. And China is really the biggest beneficiary in the international system to the impact of 9/11. Now I draw a different map. I say a country or region is functioning within the global economy, within the world system, if the following characteristics are roughly met. First, they welcome the connectivity, which everybody wants, but they're not always able to deal with the content flows. Good example, China wants internet connectivity. China also goes to great lengths, with Cisco's help, to create the most sophisticated internet monitoring and blocking system on the planet. Probably number 2 in that regard is Iran. Countries that are opening up to connectivity typically want to be able to control content. Why? Globalization, as it comes in, tends to feed the society a lot of, in the eyes of the elites there, dangerous ideas. Most they like to see, some they don't like to see. The biggest one they most often don't like to see, of course, is the imagery of our women and the roles of our women in society. If you want to piss off a young man in a traditional society, come into his society and start messing with his definitions of love, marriage, sex, family, wives, children, raising families, education, the role of women in economics, God forbid, the role of women in politics. Because you will engender a response that is profound. And you will find young men willing to die and fight and kill in the most perverse fashion to prevent that outcome. We find in polling data, they like our politics. They don't like all our policies, but they like our political system. They admire it. They want it for their own countries. They like our economics. What they can't stand are our views on sex and gender relations. That's the hardest thing. I'll say a country or region is functioning if it seeks to harmonize its internal rule sets with the emerging global rule sets, which I will shorthand as free markets, free trade, transparency, collective security. Does it look an awful lot like Americanization? At this point in history, sure, because we're fundamentally the source code for this era's version of globalization, not the original source code that came out of the European colonial experience and died in 2 massive civil wars across the first half of the 20th century. This is the one that came out of our experience, Second Industrial Revolution, and the first war against between an integrating society, the North, and a fundamentalist exclusionary society, the South, in the American Civil War. The U.S. South, prior to the Civil War, was much like Saudi Arabia today, thinly connected to the global economy. In effect, send in the slaves, send out the cotton, or today the oil, and don't ask any questions about how we order our social life. My point is, there is no conflict that you can find in the world today that you can't find in American history, no matter how perverse, no matter how genocidal, no matter how tinged with religious overtones. We've done it all. Globalization is always evolving, and the rule sets that are associated with it are always evolving, which is my clever way of saying I won't give you a firm definition of that rule set, because I don't believe it's useful to provide one, because it's constantly being negotiated. The global rule set's not just Davos man's definitions, it's also Seattle man's definitions, and increasingly it's Osama man's definitions. Davos man says go fast, Seattle man says go slow, Osama man says get it out of my face or I'll kill you. Direction is critical, not degree. China is still ruled by a communist party whose ideological mix is about 30% Marxist-Leninist, about 70% the Sopranos. I recently got a review in a defense intelligence journal where they said Barnett's certainly optimistic about China if he expects the Chinese leadership to give up their diehard commitment to communism. And my reply was, buddy, they gave it up 25 years ago. What they haven't given up is single-party rule. But most countries that frankly develop have single-party rule. Japan did, South Korea did, Singapore still does, Mexico did. To be functioning doesn't mean bad things can't happen to you. We don't repeal the business cycle. Dropping out is always a possibility. Functioning, NAFTA, Europe, both old and new, Russia under Putin's managed democracy. It ain't pretty. But frankly, there was no real democracy in Russia across the 1990s. So it wasn't much of a backtrack. China in a coastal sense, India in a pockmarked sense, Japan, South Korea, industrialized Asia, South Africa, the country, Botswana on a good day, the ABCs over here. Put a circle around it, call it the functioning core of globalization. A little more than 4 billion out of a global population is 6.4. No appreciable levels of mass violence. No real security dilemmas if you get past some tailbones left over from the Cold War. no real active role for the U.S. military. The parts of the world that function. Now I show you the parts of the world that don't function, aren't so well connected to the global economy. And this is what I describe as the natural demand pattern for the exporting of U.S. security since the end of the Cold War. Almost 150 cases in 15 years. Now all I did first was to draw a line around it, realizing that I was trapping some very globalizing societies inside that red blob, like in Israel, like a Costa Rica, like a Singapore. But when I brief these countries, they say, we know exactly what kind of neighborhoods we live in. This is why we like having good relationships with the United States, and especially the U.S. military. I'm also leaving on the outlier fringe North Korea and Kim Jong-il, which exist in an otherwise stable Northeast Asia. But I believe that little guy still serves a function. Over his grave, you build an East Asian NATO. And I argue for doing it now, as soon as possible, as opposed to later, and locking China into a strategic relationship, because China's price is only going to go up over time. I call this the non-integrating gap. It's globalization's ozone hole. It's a bald spot. No matter how you measure connectivity, in all its forms, physical, virtual, movement of people, goods, services, money, thicker in the blue, thinner inside the red. So if you're fighting against globalization, you can't handle the content flows because they're too challenging to your traditional societies. They ask too much change too quickly. Or you're just too damn poor, you're too landlocked. There's too much violence that keeps foreign direct investment away from your country. If those conditions hold, you live inside the gap, and you account for, in aggregate, roughly 95% of our security market since the end of the Cold War. Meanwhile, if you're not part of the problem, you need to be looked upon as part of the solution. First time ever China called the White House unannounced was on September 11th. Jiang Zemin called George Bush and said, we're on your side. He wasn't sure exactly what side that was, but he knew he was on that side. Why? China's not interested in Osama bin Laden's offer to return to the 7th century. China's been there, done that. Here's the problem for the Bush administration, though. They have enunciated a lot of seemingly new national security policies, which, upon first view, look like reversals of long-held, cherished ideals that got us through the Cold War safely. Preemption falls into this category. My point with this distinction is to say, don't confuse the stable security rule sets that define the core with the lack of one inside the gap. We don't talk about arms control, strategic arms control, with anybody inside the core anymore. And that was only the dominant security agenda the second half of the Cold War. I spent 10 years in college getting ready for my brilliant career as an arms control negotiator, picking up my PhD in 1990. Got one swing at the bat, and then the Soviets were gone about 5 months into my career. But globalization's a bitch like that. It forces you to switch your careers. When we're talking about preemption, we're talking exclusively inside the gap. How do I know? International Criminal Court Treaty. We don't care for the International Criminal Court. Clinton administration didn't care for it, neither does the Bush administration. They worry about their officials, their troops, being brought into that court under the guise of war crime trials. And what they believe, and what I would argue, are rule-enforcing activities on behalf of the global system. So they have concluded, the Bush administration, 93 so far, so-called bilateral exclusionary treaties based on Article 98 of the ICC Treaty. In Article 98, it allows you to conclude a bilateral with another country that says, in effect, if I invade you, you invade me for any reason, the second party won't sue the first party for damages after the fact. I call it an interventionary prenuptial. We've signed 93 of these. There's 100 countries inside the gap. 91 of the 93 treaties we've signed are with countries inside the gap. You do a projection of the countries, it's basically my map. So there's no mystery where we're going in this global war on terrorism. Countries would prefer to sign up for the service beforehand rather than risk some sort of debilitating situation emerging and being told by the Pentagon, we'd love to help you, but our lawyers advise against it. We've seen the enunciation of a seam of deterrence or suppression for bad things coming out of the gap into the core. 3 biggies: pandemics, drugs, terror. My wife and I, after having 3 biological children, which means we just had sex, adopted a baby girl from China last August. As we walked through Hong Kong International Airport, I saw a big screen off to the side, and there were people walking across this screen. And as I walked by, I waved my hand, and I realized the guy on the screen was me, along with my family members. So I went over and asked them, what are you doing? They said, we're scanning your temperature as you walk down the hallway. I said, really, what's that for? They said, if you have a temperature, you get 48 hours, all expense paid, vacation by you in beautiful downtown Hong Kong. Because you can't travel out of Hong Kong International Airport with the temperature. That is not your right. That's SARS, that's avian flu, and that's a technology you're going to see replicated all around the gap. It's not one rule set for the United States and another for the rest of the world. It's realizing that globalization is not a binary outcome. Despite its name, it's not everywhere. It is a what and a where, and its spread can be measured. What you're looking at in the red blob is basically those parts of the world where globalization has not extended itself in deep connectivity. So in the blue, 2/3 of humanity, national economies integrating peacefully. Inside the red, since the end of the Cold War, all the wars, all the civil wars, all the ethnic cleansing, all the genocide, all the mass rape as a tool of terror, all the children forced into combat units, all the UN peacekeeping missions, all the US nation-building missions. According to a paper that was done at the Army War College, you just smush the corners of that map a little bit in terms of the gap, you can capture 97% of all terrorist activity. Virtually all the big drug exporters that we worry about, inside the gap. So it's not when unilateralism makes sense, but where. The core is still a multilateral world in a big, big way. We have seen a huge uptick in bilateral mill-mill assistance flowing from the United States to what I call seam states that ring the gap. Huge uptick since 9/11. That's where the money's gone. All to raise security practices, to deal with the front lines of this perceived global war on terrorism. When we talk about unilateralism inside the gap, we're talking about a functional unilateralism, the only military in the world that can project power distant from its shores in massive quantities, sustained, is the US military. Nobody comes close. The Chinese, as a near-peer competitor, is a joke in that regard. They recently had their first military incursion of any note in North America. They sent 130 riot police to Haiti. I give them about 2 weeks if they lose room service. We send a couple 100,000 to the Middle East to wage war and everything that goes with them. Nobody can do that. Nobody comes close. We may ask the UN to bless us with resolutions and dress us with coalition partners that frankly we don't need for the war fighting. And sometimes that unpleasant and inescapable truth pops out of our lips in press conferences and we're embarrassed about it. But the reality is we don't need them for the war. What we need them for is the peace. Because if we don't have the capacity to do the peace well, we don't get to leave the scene. When you talk to people down at SOCOM, that's their number one problem right now. They can't go on to the next thing. So it's not the U.S. flouting their rules, but stepping up to the unique tasks and not being a global cop by any stretch of the imagination. Although we have walked the beat 24/7 inside the gap since the end of the Cold War. I emphasize it's a boundable problem. We're talking about 1/3 of humanity. We're talking about, frankly, 13% of the global economy because that other 2/3 controls almost 90%. But geographically, it's a big job. The usual projection previous. Here's a better projection I like, the Peters projection. What's neat about the Peters projection is everything lines up north, south, east, west, which is why it looks a little funky to your eyes. The other cool thing about the Peters projection, area accurate. Here's a secret of cartography. Greenland is actually much smaller than Africa. It's about the size of the Sudan. This is what it looks like on this sort of map, and you get a sense of the geographic spread. It's big. Now, since the end of the Cold War, we've been closing bases throughout the core, and we've been opening new bases in the gap. And all Andy Hone is talking about, global reposturing of our bases, is moving everything closer into the gap. This is the expeditionary theater for the 21st century. Can't vote it out of office. It's not a neocon invention. It's just there. Now, since the end of since 9/11, I think we've come to the conclusion increasingly that we got, in effect, too many cooks working the same broth. Here's your UCP from the past. Southcom, UCOM, strangely enough, owning most of Africa, CENTCOM, and then PACOM. This is an artifact of the way we look at the world, and we draw vertical lines to divide it, because we had an east-west fixation. Problem is, our opponent tends to move east-west and fight north-south. The time I spend down at CENTCOM, SOCOM, I've come to some conclusions about what I consider to be the boundary conditions between these AORs. First, a tactical seam exists between CENTCOM and UCOM in Africa. As we drive the fighters and the global Salafi jihadist movement out of the Middle East, that fight will head south, if we're lucky, and not north, into sub-Saharan Africa. And when you talk to people in CENTCOM, they will tell you already, in effect, that's strategic rear for Al-Qaeda. It's where they hide their people, their guns, their gold, their money. But CENTCOM doesn't talk to those countries, which is a real problem. An operational seam exists to the north. Since we've gone on the offensive after 9/11, so-called transnational global terrorism, centered on the Middle East, has the same reach pattern that we saw in the 70s and 80s, meaning they can blow stuff up at will in the Middle East, fine. All terrorism is local. And they can reach, with some effort, into southern Europe and southern Russia now, like Beslan. So here's a problem for us. We put a big bang on the Middle East, and the ricochets hit most of our allies. The real problem for CENTCOM is that their strategic seam lies to the east. Asia already takes out 2/3 of the oil coming out of the Persian Gulf. 20 years, it's going to be more like 70-75%. The United States takes out about 16% now. We'll take out about 16% in 20 years. So their oil, our blood. And they know about this. They're not confused about the situation, which is why I argue China, India, Korea, Japan are all coming to the Middle East militarily for the same reasons we did 30 years ago. They'll come to protect their stuff. That I guarantee. The only question is, under what conditions do we welcome them or not welcome them? Because their access points are typically going to be countries that we don't have good relations with, which is why China and India get in bed so deeply on oil and natural gas with Iran. And if we expect India and China to choose us over Iran, then we're only dimly aware of their future energy requirements. We've also seen the redefinition of SOCOM as the head of the global war on terrorism. That came out of OEF when Rumsfeld's eyes, as he told me, were opened. So in effect, he declared them a cannibalizing agent within the U.S. military, saying to the rest of the U.S. military, this is where the future of warfighting is going. You want to kill people on a regular basis, go be more like them. And we've seen the redefinition of STRATCOM in terms of a global strike force, moving off its nuclear missile roots increasingly in the direction of targeting individuals around the planet, the ability to find and kill individuals. Here's the mantra from the book, Disconnectedness Defines Danger. It has huge implications for the intelligence community, which I argue is like the drunk who looks for his car keys under the street lamp even though his car is parked 2 blocks away, because the light is better over here. The reason why the IC knows the core is because the light is better over there. And the reason why they don't get the gap is because those are the dark spots of the world, the off-grid locations, where it's tougher to find things, where the information we seek tends not to be classified. It just tends to be idiosyncratic and local. Implications from this map. Again, the advantages of exterior position, all the good stuff's on the outside. We got to get more sensor focus to reduce ambiguous warning. We got to focus on prevention, vice retaliation. Why? We don't just want to strike back. So we got to be out there interacting with this world, not with all our forces, but with a lot of them, especially our people. We got to get more rugged and urban, because to be seen in this war is to be killed. So they will hide in increasingly remote locations. You got to get more soft-like. Doesn't mean you double soft. In fact, you probably don't need to double the numbers of actual trigger pullers or increase them much at all. What you need to increase in the short term is our ability for the guys who come in and deal with the situation after the war fighting is done, so that the trigger pullers can leave as quickly as possible. We have interesting coalition opportunities here. I just spoke down at SOCOM at a big convention they sort of had that brought all the special ops guys from around the world together. And it's amazing to talk to some of these guys from these tiny countries. They have no military budget. What they got is the ability and the time and the people that can create soft capabilities. We shift from the definitions of old bases to new bases. Here's the speed differentiation, which I think a lot of people miss. We differentiate between tactical speed, which we buy because it keeps our people alive. Speed kills. It works. We should buy it. Operational speed, I like to refer to it as net-centric warfare's Wayne Gretzky speed. Wayne Gretzky was asked, why are you the greatest hockey player in the history of the NHL? You don't actually skate very fast. He said, I don't skate to where the puck is. I skate to where the puck's going to be. That's what we mean by moving bytes faster than bullets. Strategic tempo is something we waste an inordinate amount of money on. This fabled ability to launch a war instantaneously anywhere on the planet, which frankly we've never done and will never do. We're a democracy. We like to debate war for months before we do it. We like to debate it all through the war and then for years and even decades afterwards. Frankly, that's what makes us a good Leviathan. It's our capacity for self-examination. Our strategic tempo should be about inevitability, not speed. We shouldn't waste money on getting there fast. We should emphasize inevitability. If I say I'm going to do something to you, I can do it, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. But of course, that creates overmatches like we saw in Iraq. If you tell somebody you're coming Tuesday morning, they're not going to be there, because it's suicide to fight against us. I've met the last Air Force general who ever shot down an enemy aircraft in a dogfight. He's a 1-star now. That's how distant we are from that warfare. I think a grand strategy is enunciated with this picture. Here's how I define it. First, you got to work across the core to improve its immune system response to 9/11-like shocks. I call them system perturbations. Because my definition of crisis has to do with the ability to ping an ever denser environment, and on that basis, yield a huge return in terms of associated damages or change, especially rule set change. If you can buy an election in Spain with 10 backpack bombs, you're going to keep trying. So you got to preserve the core to grow the core. Second, you got to discreetly fire all the core off from the gap's worst exports. I already talked about that. Third, you got to shrink the gap by exporting security to its worst sinkholes there. And you will need 2 different forces to do this. And yes, what you're trying to do is make the world safe for capitalism. Absolutely. A nefarious concept to some. Frankly, it's what our military's been about throughout its entire history until it came into the delusion, based on the Cold War mad standoff, that somehow military power was abstracted from life and wasn't part of a military market nexus that's been fundamental to the advance of the human civilization since the beginning of time. The warrior culture, the merchant culture. The real purpose in enunciating something like this is giving a finishing line for people to latch onto. A happy ending that says current sacrifice yields this. My definition of a happy ending is making globalization truly global in a reasonably just manner, as quickly as possible. Ending the disconnectedness that gets you terrorism. It's not poverty, it's not ignorance. Most terrorists are middle class, smart, educated. What they don't see is a future that includes them. They can't stop that future for us, but they can try to degrade our enjoyment of it. Now I think this segues into a way of thinking about an ordering principle for DoD. What do I mean by an ordering principle? I'm talking about the core conflict model around which everything is planned, procured, organized, trained, operated, most importantly, how you become a flag. Change that, change the military in about a decade, because that's how fast we swap them out. We're seeing the inklings of this. I talk about it in the current issue of Esquire in a profile on Rumsfeld with the proposed national security personnel system, which a lot of people in Congress are looking upon as a model for the rest of the U.S. government. Since we created DoD back in 1947, we had an ordering principle. It's basically great power war with nukes. We assumed our opponent would be large and have a lot of technology just like us, and we'd fight an all-out declared war. We've never actually done that, but we prepared for it. And frankly, still are organized largely around it. My argument is if you're going to transform, if you're going to move into a real future worth creating, you're going to have a larger definition of crisis and instability in the system. This definition of a system perturbation comes out of the work with the Y2K. You can read all about it on my website. What do I mean by system perturbation? An international security order thrown into a state of some confusion by a perversely shocking development somewhere in the global economy. 9/11 was the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history. I got to watch about 3 dozen people I knew fairly well die on television before my eyes, and I knew they were dying, and I was meant to know they were dying. I was meant to be imprinted upon, to be impressed, and I was very impressed. We have to understand when we lay a big bang on the Middle East, and the Marines are walking unopposed through Baghdad that Tuesday morning, back in 2003, and those statues are toppling one by one. That was a huge system perturbation centered on Arab culture. And we are dealing with the blowback ever since. And the vehemence shouldn't surprise anybody. That was the whole purpose. The vertical shock generates an outflow of horizontal waves. They can grow over time. Think of the SARS super spreaders. One guy gets on a plane in Hong Kong, shuts down Toronto. In the outflow process, every rule set seemingly knocked out of equilibrium. New rules come out of it. The fluxing of the system's temporary but path dependent. You have anthrax all by itself, nothing else happens that year. You got a Michael Moore movie, makes about $10 million. You got Bowling and Columbine. You get 9/11 plus anthrax plus Afghanistan plus Iraq. You got a Michael Moore movie, makes about $200 million worldwide. Why? That's a hell of a causal chain. And if the Bush administration can't explain it to our satisfaction, Michael Moore has his own theories and are very entertaining. The potential for clash, sometimes it's almost violent or could be very kinetic, like India and Pakistan after the 12/13 bombing in the New Delhi Parliament. Sometimes it's just name calling. You're from Venus, you're from Mars. Sometimes it's a major rule set reset that goes under most people's radars, like what's happened in Asia on healthcare coordination among nation states in the aftermath of SARS, and see the difference in the response to avian flu. End states, some things stick, some new things come about, some of them quite scary, a mixing of old and new. Russia joins out of the blue NATO, de facto, 6 months after 9/11. No one was predicting this. The people involved will tell you, Lord Robinson said publicly, this is because of 9/11. But Russia still faces F-16s in the Baltics. In or out? Are you in or are you out? We can't seem to make up our mind, much less ask the question. So what does this do to the way we think about war? Three-tiered perspective I've been using my entire career. It comes from Ken Waltz, Man, State, and War, a classic of international relations theory, 1954. Look at the world in terms of a system. Nation states, individuals living within nation states, within a system of nation states. What we had in the Cold War was great power war as an organizing model. Because we couldn't fight the Soviets directly, and we decided after Korea we couldn't do it with China either, at the level of nation states, we engaged in proxy wars. Down at the level of individuals, we had the original lesser includeds, which we preferred to leave to law enforcement. This is what we organized around. 90% of our day-to-day activity was the bottom two categories. We sub-optimized for 90% of our market because that 10% possibility was everything. In the 1990s, the Soviets don't come along, so we downshift. We say, maybe two major theater wars could be just like a great power war, especially if we stack them one on top of the other. And how do we do this? We get a former congressman to be the Secretary of Defense. He cranks out this abstract force-sizing principle, which has stuck ever since. The two Mercs, it's called two whatevers now. They got a new acronym every other year. But it sticks. Why? It serves the Navy's purposes. It serves anybody's purposes who argues for big war components and weapons systems. Down here, everybody got a promotion. I'm not a client state, I'm a failed state. Meaning I failed to attract your attention or your help. I'm not just a terrorist, I'm a transnational actor now. Up here we didn't have anything, so we made something up after the Taiwan Straits crisis, 95, 96. We fell in love with China, or at least parts of our military strategic planning community did. And they're not going to give her up under any circumstances. I say it's China all grown up. Gonna be a looker. This is what we sold to Congress. Current iteration. What do we need for a focus? Some people say focus on protecting Americans all across the world. At home, everywhere. Bodyguard Americans. This was a knee-jerk reaction. I don't believe in the concept of Homeland Security. I think for us to come up with this concept at the dawning of the age of the most expansive globalization we've ever seen is probably the most idiotic strategic concept we've ever created. The notion that we can defend a homeland in an interconnected world and pretend that that is something that's divisible. Military hates Homeland Security. They mouthpiece it like crazy, but they hate it. Because they fear it's dragging them down into the muck and ruining this military progressively over time. I say relax, we now got the third largest federal department for that. TSA, thousands standing around. Just be grateful Richard Reed didn't shove that bomb up his rear end. So you'd be taking off a lot more than your shoes at that point. And homophobic America would be brought to a standstill. Some people say we just did Sicily, let's figure out who Italy is. The main components of this strategic vision. Let's roll. Bring it on. Who's next? You talking to me? This is grand strategy at its best. We're a system-level power. We need a system-level definition of security and stability. This is a problem of success, not failure. It represents the increasingly deeper reach of the U.S. military across time, across my short 15-year career. When I got into this business 15 years ago, I engaged in planning strategic nuclear targeting of the Soviet Union because we were going to fight a war across the system against the bloc. By the middle of my career, it was all about taking down regional hegemons. At this point in my career, it's all about killing individuals. Think about this trajectory. We went into Panama, which was the real model for OIF. Just cause on steroids. We went into Panama looking for one guy. We went into Somalia, decided it was one guy and a couple of his lieutenants. We dicked around in the Balkans for years until we started targeting Milosevic directly, his family members, his business associates. And we bombed the Russians to the table. We went into Iraq looking for a deck of cards. We're like the cops who run in, shoot the place up, say we're only here for the bad guys, snatch them, leave, apologize for all the damage, pass out some forms, say we'll pay for everything. When I got into this business, the standard was an 8 to 9 minute response to the Soviets launching global nuclear Armageddon. Our standard now, a UAV operating on the other side of the world. Find, recognize, target, kill, one guy, 8 to 9 minutes. We've gone from blowing up the world to killing one guy in 8 to 9 minutes. That's an amazing trajectory. So how much does our force mirror this trajectory? I'll argue what we inherited from the Cold War, the spread of capabilities, looked like this. Most of our capabilities were arrayed at the nation-state level, meaning they were created to fight other nation-states' militaries. Our ships fight their ships. Our tanks fight their tanks. This was the desired symmetry. The Soviets sized our forces for 4 decades. When the Bush administration came in, that RMA crowd associated with them, their dream of a future military was amazingly pristine, strategic heavy. We were going to fight the Chinese without getting out of our chairs in Honolulu. Long-range arms, a certain capacity at the nation-state level to take on regional hegemons, wanted nothing to do with subnational violence, peacekeeping, nation-building. They bragged about it. Well, the global war on terrorism adds back in that bottom half. And if I drew it according to scale, it would look more like this, because it's basically Special Operations Command and about 50,000 reservists we run ragged. This gets you a brilliant Iraq war. The footprint there made sense. This gets you a terrible occupation. Shinseki was right on the far side. We're going to move from the diamond to the hourglass, and it won't be easy. I call that force on top the Leviathan. I call that force on the bottom the sysadmin force. Why this kind of vision matters. Here's your new national military strategic view, comparing what we had in terms of a focus in '93 to the focus we have in 2004. This is what Ryan Henry delivered Don Rumsfeld last fall. It's based on what Art Zebrowski delivered. It's based on what I delivered to Art Zebrowski. It's based on what we drew on a whiteboard at the Naval War College. The decoding, that's about individuals. That's about nation states. This is about system-level threats. We go from the diamond to the hourglass. But here's the graduate-level version of the brief. You need to compare these two. The legacy is the capabilities, and this is the new threat definition. And when you put those two things together, the argument becomes, if you want to maintain a hedge, the difference between our capabilities and the threat out there at the level of nation states, that Leviathan force, if you want to maintain that hedge, you're going to have to outsource what I call the sysadmin function as much as possible. So to keep the big war, you got to outsource and invest in your small war capabilities. The argument I make with the Iraq occupation. Here I'm jumping into the second book because I made these slides up after the first book was published. Here's my favorite parody of the 1990s, a really stupid concept in terms of its enunciation. The theory of anti-access area denial asymmetrical strategies. What does it mean? It means I'm really big and anybody I fight is going to be small compared to me. So if they fight me straight up, I'm going to kick their ass. But we can't talk like that to Congress because they know what we were describing then. So instead, we call it area access, anti-access area denial asymmetrical strategies. And the congressman's eyes, frankly, glaze over. And then he asks, somewhat dumbfoundedly, will you build it in my district? Here's my parody of this notion. It ain't much of a parody because it lives on very desperately in O&I. Think about a battle space. Taiwan Straits, 2025. Think about an enemy embedded within that battle space. A couple of fancy subs and the million-man swim. Think about the U.S. trying to access that battle space instantaneously. They're going to throw up air denial, anti-access asymmetrical strategies. A banana peel on the tarmac. Trojan horses in our computer networks. It's a fait accompli, you win. Western civilization is decimated. The geographic focus here is amazing. The focus on the start of conflict is amazing. It yields what we have today, a first-half team that fights in a league that insists on keeping score until the end of the game. And frankly, won't engage us in the first half anymore. This is how I think you should think about it. No battle space we can't access. What we have trouble accessing is the transition space. What we have trouble reaching is the peace space that allows us to move on. This is not about overwhelming force. It is about overwhelming presence. It's about proportional force, more and more and more. So the non-lethals that we have not been buying. This is not about projecting power, but about staying power, which has most to do with the legitimacy you establish with the locals. Nobody bombs our bases in Germany because they're legitimate there. Who do you access? You access coalition partners, internal, that need to be viable, external. We asked the Indians for 17,000 peacekeepers early in the occupation. Based on my discussions with the senior leadership there, they wanted to give us 17,000 peacekeepers because they consider themselves a major Persian Gulf power. They have no idea why we don't realize that. But in effect, the Indian parliament said, you guys are a lot of hat, not much cattle in that middle space. We don't think you know what you're doing. And they were right, so they said no. We asked Putin for 40,000. When I was in China last August, I said, you should have 50,000 troops there. It's your oil. They said, you know, you're right. It is our oil. But as long as you're going to do all this shooting, that's fine by us. You access different enemies across these three spaces. This is war. This is everything else. We have a brilliant Secretary of War. We don't have a Secretary for everything else, because if we did, he'd be testifying right now, still, in front of the Senate over Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. But we don't have one. It wasn't Doug Feith. Sure as hell wasn't Paul Wolfowitz. There's your Leviathan force. That's the sysadmin function I'm talking about. What I think this represents, I talked about it yesterday, is the big lack that we have in the system right now, the big gap in the international global rule set, the lack of an A to Z process for rehabilitating politically bankrupt states. We got one for economically bankrupt states. It's called the IMF Sovereign Bankruptcy Plan. Go in at A, come out at Z. We tend to rewrite the rules every time somebody does this. Russia paid 50 cents on the dollar. Argentina decided 33 cents was enough. And they got away with it. That's a system. What we don't have is a system for processing politically bankrupt states. The Mugabes, the Kim Jong-ils. What would it look like? Front half, back half, red line in the middle. Let's call it mission accomplished. What we got extant in the system right now is the UN Security Council, which acts as a grand jury. It can indict your ass. It can talk about it. It can invent new words to describe your bad behavior. It could vote on it. It could send you a letter saying, please stop doing that. And that's about it. That's what gets you 250,000 dead in Darfur. What do the peacekeepers do? They show up afterwards and they take pictures of the burned out villages and all the corpses. What we have downstream is a U.S. Leviathan force. It's more than happy to take that guy down for you. It says, in effect, you want me to do it? I'll do it on Tuesday. It'll cost you $23 billion. But you know what? I want to leave as soon as I get the bad guy. Way downstream, we have an International Criminal Court based on the War Crimes Tribunal coming out of the Balkans. That's where Milosevic is now. What we're missing? Functioning executive to translate will into action. And when we break out this bubba without the sense of executive decision-making, it scares people. Frankly, we couldn't get the executive decision-making to happen on Iraq like we did with NATO on the Balkans. So we tried to convince the American public it was an imminent threat, which it wasn't. We tried to convince the American public it was mano a mano, us versus them, which it wasn't. We haven't faced an imminent threat in about 40 years. But we still use this language, however antiquated it is. And frankly, when those arguments don't work, we scream, he's got a gun, just as we rush in. And we shoot the place up, and if we search the body afterwards and it's just an old cigarette lighter, well, then we apologize and we say it was dark. And we ask the French if they'd like to do it next time, and the French say no. We just like making fun of you guys when you get it wrong. What we need is a core-enabled sysadmin force. Should have been 250,000 troops there. 50,000 Russians, 50,000 Indians, 50,000 Chinese, 50,000 Europeans, 50,000 Americans. The problem with your coalition force right now is its Occidental skin tone. Our enemies believe we're a weak society. That's the root of Occidentalism. That's the definition of Occidentalism. We're a weak, decadent, Borg-like society that somehow, despite our Borg-like computer brains, is addicted to sex. And we're dominated by our women. So if you just punch these guys hard in the face once, cut a few heads off on television, stream it on the internet, these guys will go running home to their mamas. We've been running into this ever since Pearl Harbor. Of course, the opposite is true. We're the most violent, bloodthirsty society on the planet. We can't get enough of it. It permeates our culture in every form. You pick a fight with us, you'll get it on all right. We need an international reconstruction fund, model on the IMF, permanent rehab fund. You're going to get this from the G20. That's where the decision-making is moved. To the G8, needs to be the G20. Why? The G20 is my old core of the West and all my new core powers, 90% of the global economy. They're going to decide how you spend the money on this. What prevents the ability to use this is fear of how the back half unfolds. The uncertainty, the sense of a zero-sum outcome. Here's my challenge to the DOD. You've got to build this force, you've got to seed it, you've got to invest in it. If we don't show we're serious about the second half, coalition partners do not show up, we do not establish a record of success, we do not create the political will and the imagination to build the six-part system. You'll tell me it's too much to ask for. I'll tell you that's what we did in the Balkans. All I'm talking about is regularizing it, codifying it, making it clear to people. Not exactly a global test. Really just going to ask about 13, 14 biggest economies. And if we get that sort of consensus, then we do it. Why this matters to the military. There's been a bifurcation brewing inside the military since the end of the Cold War, as some stick with reality and some move increasingly towards desire. We get the Berlin Wall, we get Desert Storm. Those in the U.S. military who start moving from reality towards desire. Good example, U.S. submarine community. Its raison d'etre disappears with the Soviet Navy. So they start imagining future opponents that will justify their platforms and their numbers. And they start moving from reality towards desire. And they create their own special coded language to describe this voyage of self-actualization. The problem is you need a big, sexy opponent to fight against. And if you don't have one, you got to make one up. Down here, the rest of the U.S. military got dragged into the muck, and they developed this derisive phrase to describe what they had to do. They called it military operations other than war. I ask you, who joins the military to do things other than war? Well, if you run the numbers, actually about 75% of them do. Not that many trigger pullers, really. Jessica Lynch was never supposed to shoot back. She was a civilian wearing a uniform. I maintain this as code inside the U.S. military for we don't want to do this. The Marines especially, and the Army more and more, got caught working the messy scene between the globalizing and non-globalizing parts of the global economy across the 90s. Clinton comes in, 92, screws up the relationship with gays in the military on Inauguration Day in a stunning strategic decision. So we're left home alone for 8 years, and what do? We buy one military, and we operate another. And we think we're going to get away with this forever. And of course, it catches up to you after a while. Where it caught up to us is in the Iraq occupation. 9/11 heals the rift. It jerks the transformation gurus out of their 30,000-foot view of the future and says, you want a networked opponent? I got one. He's like in 120 countries. Help me figure it out. How many submarines does it take to recapture Fallujah? Not enough. And it elevates this from crap to grand strategy, because that's how you're going to shrink the gap. Some people put these two things together and they call it empire, like that Scottish historian. I will note my book kicked his book's ass throughout the entire run. I prefer the phrase system administrator. We enforce the minimal rule sets that allow countries to remain connected to the global economy. Last section, how this changes the structure of the U.S. military. I'm not predicting this as a possibility. I'm telling you, it's been happening. It is continuing to happen. It is accelerating. It's not happening because I say so. It's happening because that's the way it's going to be. Defense and security, the difference. Homeland defense means defending the contiguous United States. Security has meant defense plus everything else historically. Written into our Constitution, maintain a Navy, raise an Army, a force for war, largely a force for peace, for stability, for security. 1947, we decide to merge these two into a single concept. And a long-term rationale becomes, we're in a hair-trigger standoff with the Soviets. We need to make coincident our definitions of national security and international stability. To attack America is to blow up the world. That's mad. So don't even think about it. What happened since the end of the Cold War is that connection is lost. Osama bin Laden kills 3 million tomorrow in Chicago. Who exactly do we torch? Kill a couple million, couple 20 million, 160 million in Pakistan? Is that going to do it for us? So what's happened since the end of the Cold War is the natural bifurcation of the U.S. military has reemerged. Now, we've been talking about splitting back to what we had prior to the Cold War. We've been talking about this since 1990. We talked about it a lot in the Naval Forces Capabilities Planning effort that begat From the Sea that I was part of. Some people say, hey, 9/11 did it for you. Now we got a home game and an away game. Again, it's the dumbest concept we've ever come up with. And the shame in creating the Department of Homeland Security, which frankly will go down as the Department of Agriculture for the 21st century. 2 bureaucrats for every terrorist in the world. Actually, it's more like 9-1 actual terrorists. The real shame with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security is that we took a lot of key assets and talent, and we pooled them and we said, it's all about us. When in reality, it's all about everybody else. We're much more resilient than we realize. The notion that you could behead the U.S. military, that you can cripple us with a vertical strike, is nonsense. They wipe out Congress, the President, the Supreme Court tomorrow. It'll take us about 10 days to reconstitute that government. And it would probably be a big improvement across the board. I find you 535 ex-congressmen and senators within 2 miles of the Capitol. I could find you 9 guys who think they're smart enough to sit on the Supreme Court in Washington. Easy. We got 50 farm teams. All they do is crank these people. I supported the Iraq War. I knew a Leviathan would do well. I knew we did not have the sysadmin force. Despite the fact that we now do nation building on average every 24 months, we have ignored this rising demand load. So what does it mean to think about 2 different militaries? This is the force nobody wants us to get rid of. That plus nukes ends great power war. This is the force the rest of the world wants us to build. It's the force the rest of the world's militaries can actually interact with. They can barely talk to the Leviathan. Australia did a strategic review of their national security recently, and they said, we came to a conclusion. There's only one country in the world that can really harm us. So we're asking America, please don't harm us. They said, we can either build a couple of ships that trail one of your carriers, or we can have an actual military. That's our choice. What does this mean in practical terms? It means you stop pretending the same 19-year-old rifleman is going to do both sets of activities. You can train the 19-year-old on instinct, hell, on Nintendo, to do what's on the left. What you need to do on the right is probably a 40-year-old cop. You need wisdom, and you're not going to get that in the 19-year-old. What it means in terms of operations. The rule, sysadmin is the force that never comes home. Always out there. Does 90% of your work. Why? Because 90% of your work is small stuff. You break out the Leviathan every so often. But here's the promise you make to the American public, your allies, your own troops. I promise not to break out the Leviathan unless I am ready, willing, and able to wage a massive, immediate, follow-on sysadmin effort. Don't plan for the war unless you plan to win the peace. In a larger sense, the process of the sysadmin force, once mission is accomplished, you're going to see a series of waves that correspond to the actual needs of a country recovering from civil strife. What they need first and foremost, the first 3 years, lots of peacekeepers. Otherwise, they spend money on revamping and re-equipping their military, which is why countries coming out of civil wars have a 40% chance of lapsing back into a civil war in the first 3 years. So you flood them with peacekeepers. And then you replace those with a flood of civilian police. And then around years 4 through 7, frankly, 4 through 7 after the conflict ends, that's when they really need official developmental aid in big numbers, because historically that's when they regain all their lost economic activity. It takes about 4 years before they can handle the flow. Now the U.S. military, U.S. government, our role in this should be front heavy. Sorry, I went a little too fast there. So we should be very front heavy, and we should pull out as quickly as possible. But the notion that we could just turn this over to allies, we can start wars, they can end peaces, will not work. We have to show this commitment. The differences between these two forces in a macro sense. The Leviathan has traditional partners that all look suspiciously like the Brits in their former colonies. The sysadmin works with everybody. The Leviathan is all about jointness. The sysadmin is all about interagency. The Leviathan, I like to say, it's your dad's military. I like them young, male, unmarried, pissed off. Your sysadmin's more like your mom's military. It's everything your dad's military fears. More married, older, more gender balanced, a lot more educated. This force will be populated with a lot of civilians who will join in their 40s. It's not the only time to pick people at 19. This force will remain under military law, all of it. A lot of this force will be under civilian law, because most of them will be civilians. This force will respect posse comitatus restrictions. This force is going to obliterate them. This force will never come under ICC purview. This one must. And yes, you will see the aging out from one service to the other, which you already see in terms of the private contractors. What are they? They're a bunch of retired guys. The Leviathan takes down networks. The sysadmin builds networks, and increasingly the Leviathan has to wage war to facilitate the sysadmin's efforts. Do we need a bigger army? Do we need a bigger military for this? Not if we have something called diplomacy. I've been told for years by the RMA crowd I can do it faster, cheaper, smaller, just as lethal. I say, great. Now I know what to do with all those cost savings, because I'm going to build that sysadmin out of your hide. And that's starting. You're seeing that in the FY06, which is why all of a sudden China's looking very scary again. Because the Navy needs it desperately for certain force structure. And the Air Force needs it desperately to argue for space wars. In terms of the sysadmin evolution, as I talked about yesterday, it's going to start inside the Pentagon because that's where the money is. But like Kellogg, Brown, and Root with Halliburton, eventually it's going to be spun off because it's going to get too different from their core competencies. So yeah, over time it's civilianized, interagencyized, internationalized. The center of gravity of this thing eventually moves across the river and hopefully lands in that shell of a dilapidated and underfunded and largely unused and unwarranted Department of Homeland Security, where that tremendous talent can be put to real use abroad instead of at home. So you're going to see the rise of a department between that of war and that of peace. We got a Defense Department that's all about dealing with countries in the gap. We got a State Department that's all about dealing with countries in the core, frankly, and has its head up its ass most of the time on the gap because they just don't get it. And their misuse and mishandling of USAID is phenomenal. What we need is a department that focuses on the real security challenge in the next 30, 40 years, moving countries from the gap to the core. Command arrangements. You already have the sysadmin commanders, Dana priests, proconsuls. Leviathan, what Peter Pace has done, what he will continue to do, is make big war planning center around what were, up until this point in history, supporting commands, but increasingly become the warfighting commands, the hedge commands. Last slide, who gets the kids? This is where the Marines in the audience get kind of nervous. And this is when they get kind of mad. But it makes perfect sense. You read Savage Wars, Max Boot. What the Marines are about, small arms, small wars. It's their entire history. They don't like the Navy. They never liked the Pentagon. They don't like the DOD. The Marines are like my West Highland Terrier. Every morning they want to get up, dig a hole, and then kill something. I say let the Marines be the Marines. I don't believe in the three-block war, which is the Marine version of we can do it all, which is bullshit. The Army's pushing their own version. SOCOM tries to push it. It's all complete nonsense. Nobody wants us to do it alone. I put the Marines with the sysadmin force to keep it from becoming a UN. Shoot at the aid workers here, the Marines are going to come over and kill you. With the Navy, strategic goes that way, surface combatants go that way. And as I like to say, that may be the actual size. I think what the Navy should be about are lots of small vessels. They pretend they own the world's oceans because they can prevent a blue water Navy from threatening us. Well, nobody has a blue water Navy, and no one's even working in the direction of a blue water Navy. So it's like elephant spray in downtown Washington. You can go around squirting your tube all day long. The fact that no elephants show up doesn't exactly prove that you're, useful. So what I like to say to officers, what I used to say to officers at Naval War College, which is one of the reasons why they fired my ass, I'd like to say, you're going to command several hundred ships in your career. That's the good news. The bad news is most of them won't have anybody on them, which isn't exactly master and commander. Carriers go both ways, swing asset. You'll see the pattern. For the Army, airborne is like carriers. Armor goes this way. Here's the dirty secret of the Air Force. You can bomb your way to victory. Problem is, if you want to secure it, you got to have boots on the ground. In terms of the Air Force, strategic lift goes in both directions. Bombers and fighters obviously go to the Leviathan, but they're going to be much smaller numbers. Much smaller. Because you can't say, I got to buy lots of F-22s to keep one guy alive when you're losing 1,500 in a 2-year occupation. It's just not a reasonable trade-off. In terms of Special Operations Command, trigger pullers go this way because they don't like to explain what they do. Civil Affairs comes over here. That bastard child is returned to its biological parents, the U.S. Army. For the trigger pullers, no off-season. They are always working. They drop in when they need to, do their business, quietly leave. Now you see me, now you don't. I was never here. The world is my playground. I want the loosest possible rule set for the trigger pullers in SOCOM. I want my trigger pullers to be trigger happy because they're the guys who are going to kill first, the guys who are going to come over here and take out the 3 million in Chicago. And I'd rather see these guys make mistakes and quietly hide those mistakes than have my political system perverted by that act, which it would be perverted. In terms of reserve component, overwhelmingly to the sysadmin force, but you got to renegotiate the contract. My 25-year-old godson, after 5 years in the National Guard, fine, he's going. My 19-year-old nephew, his younger brother, 3 months into the Guard, goes. His freshman year in college. That is not fair. That's not a good contract. It's not what we promised. In terms of the IC, the muscle goes this way. You saw this pissing contest over the Intelligence Reform Bill. What should be over here is what the CIA was designed to do originally. It was supposed to be a central intelligence agency instead of the puzzle palace. The closest thing we have to what it should be is the NIC, the National Intelligence Council, which actually gives its information out on the web by and large. And you know what? It's actually useful, whereas most of the crap that comes out of the CIA is meaningless. What's funny is This is mostly classified information. What we've learned in the Iraq occupation, duh, is that almost none of this is classified. All you have to do is ask them. They'll tell you. It's local information. So when our echo boomers were over there dealing with the counterinsurgency, one of the first things they did was they created internet chat rooms to teach each other how to do counterinsurgency because they felt their superiors didn't know their ass from their elbows and they weren't trained for this. And their superiors got mad and they said, you shouldn't be using computers for personal things. Moreover, you're revealing and you're putting at risk operational security. And you know what the echo boomer said back to them? You dumbasses. Al-Qaeda already knows all this stuff. We're the guys not in the know. Censors and transparency go both directions, but you'd like to see them used primarily over here. That's where the golf balls and everything else make most sense. It's owning the world in a transparent sense. Take any questions? Sure.
By the way, I read your book. It's good. I recommend it. Regarding places like Africa, we're focused an awful lot on the Middle East these days and taking some heat for only wanting the oil. I see Africa, South America as part of your plan. I know we have some activities in South America these days, but how do we address if Africa is such an important part of this, why are we not there?
I spent a lot of time talking about that in the second book because that's, in many ways the second book is built around the questions I got in response to the first book. And it's a great question. I think the sequential shrinking of the gap comes in clumps. It tends to come when a region has a critical mass, and all of a sudden we stop thinking about that as being third world, and all of a sudden it's a safer environment for FDI, foreign direct investment. I think if we can cut some deals with China over Taiwan and over North Korea, the first place that gets absorbed into the core is Southeast Asia on the undertow of China's economic emergence. Okay? We will remain fixated on the Middle East because the global Salafi jihadist movement is centered there. And it represents the latest version of an anti-capitalist response to the ever-increasing spread of the global economy, which comes out of the second industrial revolution in the United States. Okay? To the extent we can drive that fight out of there, if we can get strategic partnership, real strategic partnership with India and China and Russia and Turkey and Iran, frankly, which is a linchpin, then we can maintain the ability to keep that fight from squeezing out into Central Asia. Hopefully we push it south as much as possible into sub-Saharan Africa. And that becomes our rationale for moving there. And we're already laying the work, the preparation for that battlefield. And that's what Jim Jones is really focused on at UCOM. Now, the other alternative, which is going to happen inevitably, and you're seeing these articles already, is that we will respond to an Asian threat, quote unquote, in Africa. China has been flooding Africa with people and investment for the last 5 years, and it's starting to get on people's radars. Now, there's not too much you can accuse them of other than building roads and creating lots of things in Africa. And if you're going to try to turn that into a threat, I say good luck. Africa's not only ours to ignore, other people can go in there and do what they want. So the threat from China and its demand for all those raw materials is really an opportunity for us. In many ways, what we should see is a division of labor. We're the Leviathan primarily. China's the sysadmin. So is India. And they become market makers. The old core is going to make most of its money on the new core in the next 25 years. The new core, Brazil, India, Russia, China, those countries are going to make most of their money developing things and serving and creating markets in the gap because they're willing to go there in ways that we're not, frankly. So that's how we get to sub-Saharan Africa fastest. I like the one campaign. I like what Bono does. But reducing debt, unless you deal with the security issues that keep money out of sub-Saharan Africa, won't change anything. We should push connectivity. We should deal with early childhood diseases. We should do whatever it takes. But I mean, look what we're doing to Brazil over the AIDS drugs thing and their desire to pirate certain AIDS drugs in Brazil. That was in the newspaper, New York Times this morning. I blogged it. We're always fighting over these kinds of issues, when in reality, we get such a big bang for that buck if we just give up a certain amount of money that we're not going to get out of Africa, frankly, for AIDS drugs. But it's such a huge return on investment if we can deal with some of the debilitating problems there, which tend to revolve around disease and warfare. You know, for every body in Africa that's shot, typically 98 other bodies are killed in that process. And it's fundamentally through economic and war refugee status. It's the movement of people. You take people and you move them, you get a huge amount of death based on that through disease and debilitation. And they tend to be young and old. So Mugabe, when he runs 1 million people out of their shanty houses because he's on a political crackdown spree now that he won his quote-unquote election, he's probably going to kill a tremendous number of people that way. I mean, tens of thousands, big numbers of people. So I think we need to get there. I think the reality is it's going to be a linear process. We're going to get to Africa through Africa through the Middle East. So the faster we get the Big Bang proceeding in the Middle East, the faster that fight will appear there, the greater our justification for going there. Security leads the way, unfortunately, because we have such a limited definition of security most of the time. Sir?
Listening to your talk, I was reminded at times about the British Empire of the 19th century, and I was wondering how you would compare the paradigm you've outlined for the 21st century to the way the British operated in the 19th, where they did a lot of systems administration as part of their security policy.
Yeah. The British Empire and the colonial model of globalization that existed prior to the First World War was basically the uncompetitive movement of raw materials from periphery to homeworld. It was not a sophisticated, integrating economy. Labor was much more fluid. Money was much more rigid. Today, money is much more fluid, and actually it's labor that has a hard time moving around. So the comparisons between the two globalizations are vastly different. We have a tendency to say they're sort of similar, but the differences overwhelm the similarities in a very profound way. Plus, the real difference between the way the Brits did it and the way that we do it is that we don't have colonial possessions. We're about enforcing rule sets for markets to come in and emerge. So it's not the same zero-sum outcome that it was between the Brits and the French and the Portuguese and the Germans, which is why if we do this well and we explain ourselves well and we see the divisions of labor that should naturally emerge between us and what I call new core powers like India, Russia, China, Brazil, then the likelihood of proxy wars and competition for resources, which is sort of a buzz concept now. We're going to fight the Chinese over access to resources in sub-Saharan Africa and whatnot. None of that needs to happen whatsoever. So similarities, yes, but I think the differences are huge in degree and in kind. Please?
If the Leviathan's contractors continue to market their wares, the big toys, to the Congress, and everything that goes with that constituency politics, then the Congress will continue to fund the big toys and support the old contractors. Let's say we switch over, shift a lot of that funding, or hypothetically try to shift the funding to your mother's war with new sets of contractors and new sets of funding. It will require the contractors to step up to this new opportunity and see the business in it.
Right.
Do you see any way to make that transition?
Well, I think we got to stop pretending that we're building one force with our regular budget and then operating it exclusively with the supplements. 80% of the supplements that we've used since the end of the Cold War have been for stabilization and reconstruction operations, which means the peace has become theoretically 4 times as expensive as the war. So, I mean, that's telling you where the market is going. What we need to do is to bring that dynamic inside the regular budget. And they're making that attempt. They're projecting that transition with the FY06. And the Leviathan, the big war constituency is going to fight it like crazy. Because they still come around, frankly, and say, you need this system. And we say, why? And they say, it's because we're selling it. And it's, we can't figure out what to sell other than that. But, there are in a Lockheed Martin, in a Boeing, all these places I go on a regular basis and brief, there are increasingly, like your advanced concepts group, there's a horizontal thinking group that's trying to figure out how to take what were these stovepiped weapons and platform systems generating divisions and have them think more horizontally about how this all comes together. And increasingly they realize they're moving from the paradigm of the few and the absurdly expensive to the many and the cheap. And it won't be easy. In many instances, they'll make that move out of fear of new entrants into the market stealing their business. And that's fine. New entrants tend to define new rules in any market, and then they tend to be absorbed by the major players. Like Lockheed Martin is considered one of the companies that may buy Kellogg Brown and Root when it spins off from Halliburton. So, I mean, you're going to see that kind of stuff time and time again. Things coming from outside the industry being absorbed into the industry. What I find with industry is that they're fairly attuned to this. And what I tell them is there's a lot more profit margin possible, frankly, in the sysadmin, in equipping the sysadmin than there is in the Leviathan. Because the contracting and the requirements are going to be much easier and more fluid, and they're going to be much closer to the experience they have in the commercial private sector. And frankly, the spin-off opportunities for what you bring to the table for the sysadmin are overwhelmingly larger than the Leviathan products that you generate. So you're going to make a lot of money the more you get into sysadmin.
Why don't we take just one more question?
Please.
One of the spin-offs of a wartime economy, which we've more or less had for 60, 65 years, is full employment. And full employment is a driver of some kind in all of this. And we have it in the United States, and European countries don't have full employment. So do you see that working as a driver in the future of the Pentagon and our policies? I mean, after all, I think part of the reason people are unwilling to give up the big war concept is because, at least it's probably subliminal by now, but it has something to do with the idea of full employment goes along with a wartime economy.
Sure, because the guys and gals got into it 30, 40, a long time ago, and their whole careers are wrapped up in it. And just like you see with change, say in Russia or any other place, in many ways, the new demand and the new products come with a new generation of workers. And the old products and the old demands die with the old labor force. It'll be generationally pushed out. And you're having that discussion over nuclear weapons now. A lot of it has to do fundamentally with the critical mass of workforce. But my argument is this stuff's inevitable. There will be a fight put up, and it'll be based mostly over jobs, just like with the BRACs. But it'll be a losing fight. So if you're under 40 and in this business, you better be moving towards the sysadmin sort of products over time, because your career opportunities are going to be restricted more and more.
But I mean, full employment for the whole country, though. I mean, we have 5% unemployment. During World War II, we had 4% unemployment when everybody was working double overtime. I mean,
and we're never going to get full employment. That's a chimera.
I know, but I mean, do you think we're going to end up having a European-style employment where they can live with 10%?
No. No, I don't.
Okay.
And I don't think we're going to have European-style benefits for unemployed either. One of the key things that will be hard for us to understand is that over time we're going to find the Chinese and the Indians and the Russians and the Brazils looking more familiar to us in their economics and the way they view the world and their kind of the dynamism of their cultures than we are old Europe and Japan. We're going to have more in tune with India than Brazil, more in tune with Iran than France, more in tune with Russia than Germany, more in tune with China than Japan, more in tune with Brazil than Canada. And that's going to be a hard shift for us. It's going to be hard for older people because they're just not going to be able to see it. And we really need to get the Scowcross and the Kissingers and the Brzezinskis to retire and, frankly, shut up. Because their visions are old and tired and they don't match reality anymore. So I say, get off the stage.
Thanks.
It's a big hit.
Okay.
Perfect.
Oh, I got to go to the bathroom.
Well, we can